The summer of 1955 was the kind that clung to your skin, the heat pressing down like a weight, making the air thick and slow. The town of Mason, Mississippi, was no stranger to scorching days. But that year, the heat seemed to burn deeper, settling into the bones of the people who lived there. It was the kind of summer that made tempers shorter, secrets harder to keep, and decisions impossible to undo. Jonathan Carter wiped the sweat from his brow as he leaned over the engine of a rusted Ford pickup, the scent of oil and metal filling the small garage where he worked. His hands were calloused, his knuckles dark with grease, but he didn't mind. The work was honest, and in a town where a black man had to be careful with every step he took, keeping his head down and his hands busy was the safest way to live. He had learned long ago that there were rules in Mason, rules that weren't written down but were enforced all the same. His world was small, made up of the shop, the small room he rented behind the old tailor's store, and the church he visited every Sunday. He knew where he could go and where he couldn't, who he could talk to and who he should avoid. He had spent his whole life following those unspoken rules, never daring to step outside the boundaries that had been set long before he was born. But that night, in a place he never should have been, Jonathan made a choice that would change everything. The underground jazz club wasn't much, just the back room of a rundown bar, the air thick with smoke and the low hum of conversation. It was a place where music drowned out the world outside, where, for a few stolen hours, people could forget about the things that divided them. Daniel, Jonathan's oldest friend, had dragged him there, insisting that a man couldn't live his whole life working and praying without taking a moment to breathe. Jonathan had planned to stay for just one drink, to listen to the music for a few minutes before slipping out the back door. But then he saw her. Eleanor Harrington was the kind of woman who didn't belong in a place like that. She stood near the bar, her auburn hair catching the dim light, her lips painted a deep shade of red that made her look untouchable. She was beautiful, yes, but there was something else. Something in the way she held herself, in the way her eyes flickered over the room like she was searching for something she couldn't name. She shouldn't have been there. A white woman in a club like this, in a town like Mason, was asking for trouble. And yet, she didn't seem afraid. Jonathan knew he should look away. He should finish his drink, nod to Daniel, and leave. But he didn't. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment, everything shifted. He expected her to turn away, to pretend she hadn't seen him, but she didn't. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, a hint of amusement playing at the corners of her mouth. It was the kind of look that made a man forget himself. "You don't dance?" she asked, her voice smooth and teasing as she stepped closer. Jonathan let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Not much of a dancer." "That's a shame." She leaned in just enough that he caught the faint scent of jasmine on her skin. "Because I think you could be." He knew it was dangerous, knew that if anyone saw them talking, there would be hell to pay. But in that moment, with the music humming between them and the weight of the summer pressing down, it didn't seem to matter. They talked that night, and the next, and the one after that. At first, it was just glances across the room, quick conversations stolen in the dim light of the club. But soon, it became something more. They met in secret, in the quiet corners of town where no one would see them, whispering dreams neither of them had ever dared to say aloud. Eleanor spoke of leaving, of escaping the life that had been chosen for her, of running far away from the expectations that suffocated her. Jonathan listened, knowing it was reckless, knowing it was impossible. But the way she looked at him made him believe, for the first time in his life, that maybe, just maybe, he could want more than what this town had given him. He told himself it wasn't real, that whatever this was between them couldn't last. But then came the night she pressed her palm to his cheek, her touch soft, her eyes full of something that made his chest tighten, and suddenly, the lines he had spent his whole life following didn't seem so clear anymore. He kissed her that night, beneath the stars, with the Mississippi air thick around them and the whole world waiting to tear them apart. And for a moment, nothing else mattered. But summer never lasts forever, and some lines, once crossed, can never be undone. The night Robert Harrington found them, Jonathan knew, before the door even slammed open, that something was wrong. It was the kind of silence that prickled against his skin, that made the fine hairs on the back of his neck rise. He had learned to trust that feeling, that quiet warning that trouble was near. They were in the small, abandoned barn at the edge of town, the one Eleanor had chosen because no one ever went there anymore. The wood was old, the scent of dust and hay lingering in the air, but it was theirs. It was the only place where they could exist without fear. She had been late that night, slipping out from the Grand Harrington estate long after the house had fallen silent, after the maids and drivers and dinner guests had all disappeared into the shadows. She had kissed him the moment she arrived, breathless and desperate, as if she already knew the moment wouldn't last. They had been reckless, lost in each other's touch, in whispered promises of escape. Jonathan had held her close, inhaling the jasmine scent that clung to her skin, and for a brief moment, it had felt real. Like maybe they could make it out of Mason together. Like maybe love was enough to burn through the chains that held them both down. But then the door flew open. The force of it rattled the walls, and Eleanor jerked away from him, her breath hitching in her throat. The figure in the doorway was tall, broad-shouldered, the outline of his body barely visible in the dim light. But Jonathan didn't need to see his face to know who it was. Robert Harrington had found them. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was Eleanor's sharp intake of breath, the heavy thud of Jonathan's heart slamming against his ribs. Then, like a storm breaking over the horizon, Robert stepped forward, his fury radiating from every inch of him. "You filthy bastard," he seethed, his voice low, dangerous. "You dare put your hands on my daughter?" Jonathan barely had time to brace himself before Robert's fist connected with his jaw. Pain exploded through his skull, white-hot and blinding, as he stumbled back. Another blow followed, this time to his ribs, and the air whooshed from his lungs. Eleanor screamed, "Daddy, stop!" She grabbed at his arm, her fingers clawing at his sleeve, but Robert shoved her away with a force that sent her staggering backward. Jonathan coughed, his vision blurring for a second before he forced himself to stay upright. He had known this day would come, had known that if anyone ever found out about them, there would be no mercy. But he hadn't expected the rage in Robert's eyes, the kind of fury that wasn't just about his daughter's betrayal but about power, about control, about the simple, unshakable belief that Jonathan was nothing. "I'll kill you," Robert hissed, reaching down to grab Jonathan by the collar of his shirt. "I should kill you right here. Leave your body in the dirt where you belong." Jonathan didn't fight back. He knew better than to swing at a man like Robert Harrington. A black man raising his fists to a white man in Mason wasn't self-defense. It was a death sentence. But Eleanor was sobbing now, her voice raw with desperation as she threw herself between them. "Please, Daddy, please, just let him go. I love him." Those words made Robert freeze. For a long, unbearable moment, the barn went silent. Jonathan could hear the distant hum of crickets outside, the slow drip of blood from his split lip. Then Robert's grip loosened, and a slow, horrible smile curled at the edges of his mouth. "You love him?" he repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. "Then you're even more pathetic than I thought." He turned to Eleanor, his face twisting with disgust. "You think this is love? You think he cares about you?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "He's using you, Eleanor. That's what they do. They take what they can and then they leave." "That's not true," she shot back, her chin trembling but her voice steady. "Jonathan isn't like that." Robert's smile vanished. He reached for her wrist and yanked her toward him, his fingers digging into her skin. "You are coming home," he said, his tone final, absolute. "And you will never see this animal again." Jonathan clenched his fists, rage burning in his chest. But what could he do? If he fought back, he would die. If he begged, it wouldn't change anything. Eleanor looked at him then, her green eyes wide with terror, her breath coming in shallow gasps. And then, in the softest voice, she whispered, "I'll come back." Jonathan barely managed a nod before Robert dragged her away, her cries echoing through the night. He watched them disappear into the darkness, his chest heaving, his body aching, his mind screaming at him to do something, anything. But there was nothing he could do. He sank to his knees, the pain in his ribs sharp with every breath. He knew what would come next. Eleanor would be locked away, hidden from him, her father ensuring that she never so much as breathed in his direction again. He would be watched, maybe even beaten worse than this, warned to never go near her again. But even as he sat there, bleeding and broken in the dirt, one thought burned through the haze of pain. This wasn't over. No matter what Robert Harrington did, no matter how impossible it seemed, Eleanor would find a way back to him. Jonathan didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Eleanor's face, her green eyes full of fear and helplessness, as her father dragged her away from him. The image was burned into his mind, relentless, unforgiving, and no matter how hard he tried to push it away, the fear for her safety only grew stronger. The town was still, silent, as if the whole world had closed its eyes to what had happened, to what was coming. But Jonathan knew it wouldn't stay that way. Robert Harrington wasn't a man who forgave easily, and he wasn't going to let his daughter slip through his fingers. He had to act, and he had to act fast. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Jonathan was already packing his meager belongings. He didn't have much, just a few clothes, his tools, and the letter that Eleanor had slipped into his hand the night before. A single line, written in a shaky, hurried script. "I'll come back to you. I promise." He couldn't stay in Mason. He knew that now. The danger was too great. The Harringtons had too much power, and the whole town was too afraid of them. If he stayed, they would find him, and he wouldn't make it out alive. But he couldn't leave without her. He couldn't leave Eleanor behind, knowing that her father would lock her away or worse, that he would make her life a prison just to punish her for falling in love with him. He spent the next few days in hiding, moving from place to place, lying low, waiting for an opportunity. And then it came. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonathan heard a soft knock on his door. His heart stopped. He knew it could only be one person, Eleanor. He opened the door cautiously, his breath catching in his chest as he saw her standing there, her face pale but determined, her eyes scanning the street behind her. She was carrying a small suitcase, and there was a fear in her gaze that made his stomach drop. "They're looking for me," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I had to leave. I couldn't stay there anymore, Jonathan. He would have locked me up. I couldn't." Her words faltered, but she didn't need to explain further. Jonathan understood. Without a word, he reached for her, pulling her into his arms. For a moment, they just stood there, clinging to each other, as if the world outside could disappear, as if nothing else mattered except the two of them, finally together. But they both knew that wasn't the reality. They couldn't stay in Mason, not now. "We need to go," he said quietly, breaking the embrace. "We need to leave tonight. We can't waste any more time." Eleanor nodded, her lips trembling. She had made her choice. She had left everything behind. The life her father had planned for her, the home she had grown up in, the safety of wealth and privilege. All of it was gone. But in its place was something else, something terrifying and exhilarating. The possibility of freedom. They didn't speak much as they left, slipping into the night like shadows, moving quickly but carefully. Jonathan led the way, keeping his eyes peeled for any sign of danger, while Eleanor followed close behind. She had always been sheltered, had always lived in a world where danger was something that happened to other people. But tonight, she was a different person. As they walked, Jonathan couldn't help but glance at her. She was so different from the woman he had met a few weeks ago. The shock of everything that had happened, the fear that now lived in her eyes, had transformed her. But in that transformation, he saw a new kind of strength. She had chosen him, had chosen a life she couldn't predict or control, but she had chosen it all the same. By the time they reached the train station, the night was fully upon them, the moon casting long shadows over the empty platform. Jonathan's heart raced as he saw the train in the distance, its headlights cutting through the darkness. It was their only chance. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, his grip tightening around her hand. He knew what it meant to run, to leave everything behind. It wasn't just about escaping. It was about what came after. Eleanor didn't hesitate. "I'm sure." And with that, they boarded the train. The sound of the wheels on the tracks was the only thing that filled the silence as they found a quiet corner in one of the freight cars. Settling down in the dark, the weight of their decision pressing down on them both. The train rattled forward, carrying them into the unknown. For the first time since all of this had started, Jonathan allowed himself to feel a flicker of hope. They were running, yes, but they were running together. And as long as they had each other, maybe, just maybe, they could outrun the world that was determined to tear them apart. But as the miles passed and the lights of Mason faded into the distance, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still ahead of them. There was no turning back now. They had made their choice, and whatever came next, they would face it together. The train carried them far from Mason, farther than either of them had ever been. For hours, they huddled together in the dim light of the freight car, listening to the steady rhythm of the wheels against the tracks. The north was their destination, not just for safety, but for a chance at a life where they could exist without fear. Eleanor clung to Jonathan's arm, exhaustion pulling at her, but she didn't sleep. Her body ached from the rough wooden floor, and the cold bit at her through her thin dress, but none of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was that they were together. When the train finally slowed at a station near a small industrial town, they knew it was time to get off. They slipped out unnoticed, stepping onto unfamiliar ground. The air was different here, thicker, colder, carrying the scent of steel and coal instead of the warm, sweet fields of home. This place was nothing like Mason. It was louder, harsher, and far less forgiving. Jonathan held Eleanor's hand as they walked through the streets, searching for anything that could help them start over. They had almost nothing, just a few dollars Jonathan had managed to save, and the clothes on their backs. He knew he would need to find work immediately, and Eleanor, she had never worked a day in her life. Would she be able to adjust? Would she regret this? They found a small boarding house run by an older black woman named Mrs. Carter, who took one look at them and saw the truth. Two young lovers on the run, desperate, hopeful, terrified. She didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations. She simply sighed, took the money Jonathan handed her, and led them to a tiny room on the second floor. It was cramped, barely big enough for a bed and a single dresser, with a small window that overlooked the gray streets below. The wallpaper was peeling, and the mattress was thin, but to them, it was everything. That first night, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window, her arms wrapped around herself. She had chosen this, she reminded herself. She had chosen Jonathan, chosen freedom. But why did she feel so afraid? Jonathan watched her, his heart aching. He knew she had given up everything for him. He knew she was scared, even if she didn't say it. So he did the only thing he could. He sat beside her, took her hand and whispered, "We're gonna be okay, Ellie." She turned to him then, her eyes searching his face. And slowly, she nodded. The next morning, Jonathan went out to find work. The town was filled with factories, their smokestacks reaching high into the sky, choking the air with soot. He walked for hours, knocking on doors, speaking to foremen, hoping someone, anyone, would give him a chance. It wasn't easy. The North wasn't the South, but racism still thrived in its own quiet ways. Most places wouldn't even look at him. Others sneered as they turned him away. But Jonathan was determined. He had no choice. Finally, after what felt like an endless day, he found work at a steel mill. The pay was low, the hours brutal, and the conditions dangerous, but it was something. It was enough to keep them afloat. Meanwhile, Eleanor faced her own struggles. She had never worked before, had never needed to. But now, with Jonathan gone for long hours at the mill, she was alone in a world she didn't understand. The other women at the boarding house, mostly widows and wives of laborers, looked at her with suspicion. She didn't belong in their world. Desperate to contribute, Eleanor took a job sewing at a textile shop, stitching fabric for long hours, her fingers raw and aching. The other workers whispered about her soft hands and fine manners, about how she was one of them, but had run away to live like one of us. But she didn't care. She had made her choice. Days turned into weeks. Their routine became their life. Jonathan left before dawn and came home long after dark, his body aching, his hands blistered from hours at the mill. Eleanor worked during the day and cooked for them at night, learning to live in a world so different from the one she had left behind. They didn't have much. They didn't have the luxuries Eleanor had once known, or the comfort of a home free from struggle. But they had each other, and for a while that was enough. But even as they built this fragile new life, shadows of the past lingered. Eleanor still dreamed of Mason, of her father's voice, of the house she had left behind, of the secret she hadn't yet told Jonathan. And somewhere, far away, Robert Harrington was still searching for her. Winter settled over the town like an iron shroud, bringing with it a cold that seeped through the thin walls of their boarding house room. Jonathan worked longer hours at the steel mill, coming home exhausted, his body aching from the relentless labor. Eleanor continued sewing at the textile shop, her hands now rough and calloused, her once pristine nails broken and uneven. She never complained, never once said she regretted leaving Mason. But in the quiet moments, when Jonathan wasn't looking, the weight of her past sat heavy on her chest. It started with the letters. The first one arrived on a gray afternoon, slipped under their door. Eleanor had been mending one of Jonathan's shirts when she noticed the envelope, its crisp white paper stark against the worn wooden floor. There was no return address, but she knew. She knew before she even picked it up. Her father had found her. With trembling hands, she unfolded the letter. The words were sharp, cold, calculated, just like him. Eleanor, you've made a mistake. You think you can run from your past, but you cannot run from me. I am your father, and I will not allow you to throw your life away. This life you've chosen, it is beneath you. You know that. You belong here, with your family. Come home before it is too late. You know what will happen if you don't. There was no signature. He didn't need one. His presence, his control, bled from every word. Eleanor could hear his voice in her head, could see the way he would look at her, his face filled with the same disappointment and quiet rage he had always carried. She crumpled the letter in her hands, her breath coming in short gasps. He knew where she was. He was watching. That night, she didn't tell Jonathan. She couldn't. Instead, she burned the letter over the small stove in their room, watching the paper curl and blacken, the ink disappearing into smoke. But no matter how much she tried to destroy it, the words lingered. A week later, another letter arrived. Eleanor, you are testing my patience. You know what I am capable of. Do not make me remind you. Eleanor's hands shook as she read it. She felt sick. She burned this letter too. The third letter was the worst. You left something behind. You think I don't know? I know everything. If you do not come home, I will make sure you never forget what you've done. Eleanor's breath hitched, her vision blurring. Her father knew. He knew about the child, the secret she had buried, the one she had never told Jonathan about, the truth she had fought so hard to escape. It was no longer hidden. She had been young, barely 17, when it happened. Her father had arranged everything, had made sure no one would ever speak of it again. The moment the child had been taken from her, she had been told to forget. And for years, she had tried. But she had never truly forgotten. She had never told Jonathan. How could she? He had always seen her as his equal, as someone who had chosen to stand beside him despite the odds. What would he think if he knew the truth? If he knew she had given up her own child? Her father was using it against her now, and she knew what he was capable of. He would find that child, wherever they were. He would use them as a weapon, as leverage to drag her back home. Panic clawed at her throat. She needed to tell Jonathan. She needed to explain everything. But how could she? How could she look him in the eye and tell him that their love, this life they had built, was built on a lie? That night, as she lay beside Jonathan in bed, she stared at the ceiling, her heart pounding. He was asleep, his breathing slow and steady, but she couldn't close her eyes. She had spent so long running, so long convincing herself that the past couldn't touch her. But she was wrong. It had found her, and this time, she wasn't sure if she could escape it. Eleanor spent the next few weeks living in a state of constant dread. Every time she stepped outside, she felt eyes on her, watching from the shadows. Every time she heard footsteps behind her on the way home, her breath hitched, fearing that one of her father's men had come to drag her back. But the worst part wasn't the fear. it was the guilt. Jonathan sensed something was wrong. He wasn't a fool. He had always been able to read Eleanor like an open book, and now, something in her had shifted. She smiled less, spoke in short sentences, and when she thought he wasn't looking, he caught her staring off into the distance with that haunted look in her eyes. At first, he assumed she was simply exhausted. The winter had been brutal, their work relentless, and the burden of making ends meet was weighing on both of them. But then, one night, he woke to find her sitting by the window, staring out into the dark street below. He sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "Ellie?" His voice was thick with exhaustion, but concern lined every word. She flinched, startled. She hesitated, then forced a small smile. "I couldn't sleep." Jonathan studied her. Even in the dim light, he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the fabric of her nightgown. He had known her long enough to recognize when she was hiding something. He sighed, swinging his legs over the bed and walking over to her. He knelt beside her chair, taking her cold hands in his. "Talk to me," he said softly. "What's wrong?" Eleanor swallowed, forcing herself to hold his gaze. The words were on the tip of her tongue. "I need to tell you something," but no matter how hard she tried, they refused to come out. I miss home." The lie felt like a knife twisting inside her. "I miss my mother." Jonathan's face softened. He understood missing family, even if hers had never accepted him. He kissed her knuckles, holding her hands tightly. "I know it's been hard, but we'll make it. I promise." Eleanor forced a nod, even as the guilt suffocated her. As the months passed, she tried to bury the truth. She threw herself into her work, into their life together. And for a while, it worked. Then, in the spring of 1959, she found out she was pregnant. She hadn't expected it, hadn't even considered the possibility. When the doctor confirmed it, she sat frozen in his small office, her hands resting on her stomach in disbelief. A child. Jonathan's child. When she told him that night, he lifted her off her feet and spun her around, his laughter filling their tiny room. "We're gonna be parents, Ellie," he whispered against her lips. "Can you believe it?" She laughed, tears in her eyes, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel something other than fear. The pregnancy brought them closer. Jonathan was more protective, more attentive, working even harder to save money for their growing family. And when their son, Isaac, was born, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. She watched Jonathan cradle their baby boy, his dark skin and bright eyes a perfect mixture of them both, and she told herself that this was enough. This was her family. This was her future. But the past didn't forget. 2 years later, their daughter, Margaret, was born, and Eleanor's happiness should have been complete. She should have felt safe. She should have felt whole. But instead, as she held her newborn daughter, all she could think about was the child she had lost, the one she had given away. She watched Isaac toddle around the small house they had moved into, laughing as Jonathan chased him, and she wondered, did her firstborn look like him? Did they have her eyes, her smile? Were they happy? Did they even know she existed? She never spoke of it. She convinced herself it was better that way. She was a wife, a mother. She had built a life out of love, even if it had been built on lies. But lies, no matter how well hidden, have a way of resurfacing. And soon, Eleanor would learn that the past never stays buried forever. The years passed, and Eleanor did everything she could to keep her secrets buried. She poured herself into raising Isaac and Margaret, ensuring their days were filled with warmth, laughter, and love. She memorized the way their tiny hands curled around hers, the way they giggled when Jonathan tossed them into the air, their eyes alight with pure joy. This was the life she had fought for, the life she had chosen. And yet, the past clung to her like a shadow, darkening even her happiest moments. Jonathan, ever devoted, never questioned the way her smiles would sometimes fade too quickly or how she would stare out the window late at night, lost in thoughts she refused to share. He assumed it was exhaustion, the burden of motherhood and long hours at the sewing shop. But it was more than that. Eleanor carried a weight that time could not erase. By the time Isaac was 8 and Margaret was 6, Eleanor's body had begun to betray her. The exhaustion she had once blamed on motherhood became something deeper, something more insidious. Her joints ached, her energy drained faster than it should, and she often found herself gasping for breath after even the smallest exertion. She ignored it at first, refusing to acknowledge the creeping weakness in her limbs. But Jonathan noticed. One evening, as she folded laundry, he watched her struggle to lift a basket, her hands trembling under its weight. Without a word, he stepped in, taking it from her. She looked up at him, startled. "I had it," she murmured, forcing a smile. His expression was gentle, but his eyes were searching. "Ellie, you've been pushing yourself too hard," he said. "You need to rest." She wanted to argue, to tell him she was fine, but the words wouldn't come, because she wasn't fine. And deep down, she knew it. The worst part wasn't the physical pain. It was the fear. She was running out of time, and she knew it. One afternoon, as she sat by the window watching the children play outside, she felt a sudden wave of dizziness crash over her. The room blurred, the sound of their laughter fading into an eerie silence. She gripped the arm of the chair, her breath shallow. A memory surfaced. A crying baby. A cold room. The echo of her father's voice. "Forget this ever happened. This child is no longer yours." She closed her eyes, her chest tightening. She had spent so many years convincing herself that the past was behind her, that what she had done was necessary. But as her body weakened, as time slipped through her fingers like sand, she realized something terrifying. She wasn't just running out of time. She was running out of chances. For years, she had told herself that Jonathan could never know, that if he found out about the child she had given away, it would destroy everything they had built. But as she sat there, watching Isaac and Margaret chase each other in the yard, she realized something even worse. What if she died without telling the truth? What if she took this secret to her grave? And what if, someday, Jonathan found out anyway? She swallowed hard, her fingers gripping the fabric of her dress. She had lived with this burden for so long, but could she truly die with it? Outside, Jonathan called for the children to come in, his voice warm and steady. Isaac laughed, running toward him, and Margaret followed close behind. Jonathan lifted them both into his arms, his smile wide and full of love. Eleanor's heart ached. She had lied to him for so long, and soon she would have to decide whether she could live with that lie, or whether she was finally brave enough to tell the truth. The first letter arrived on a damp afternoon, tucked between bills and advertisements in the small metal mailbox outside their home. Eleanor nearly missed it, distracted by the weight of her own exhaustion as she sorted through the envelopes. But the moment she saw the unfamiliar handwriting on the plain white envelope, her breath caught in her throat. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. At first, there were only a few words, scrawled in dark ink on a single sheet of paper. "I know who you are." The world around her seemed to narrow, the distant sound of Isaac and Margaret playing in the next room fading into a dull hum. Her heart pounded against her ribs. She read the words over and over, as if trying to decipher some hidden meaning, but there was none. It was a warning, a threat, a ghost from the past reaching out, clawing at the life she had so desperately tried to build. Eleanor's fingers clenched the paper so tightly that the edges crumpled. She forced herself to breathe, to think. No return address, no signature, just those 5 words. She glanced around as if expecting someone to be watching her from the shadows, but the house was still. Jonathan was at work. The children were upstairs. There was no one outside the window, no figure lurking in the street. But someone knew. She rushed to the kitchen, her pulse roaring in her ears, and grabbed a match from the counter. She struck it against the rough surface of the stove, watching the small flame flicker to life. Then, without hesitation, she held the letter over it. The paper curled as the fire consumed it, the ink blackening, the words disappearing into ash. She watched until there was nothing left but smoldering scraps, then swept them into the trash with shaking hands. But the flames could not erase the fear that gripped her. Who had sent it? Could it be her father? After all these years? No, he would have done worse than send a letter. Was it someone from back home who knew her secret? Someone who had seen what happened all those years ago. Or, her stomach twisted as a more terrifying thought took hold. Had her lost child found her? The possibility struck her like a bolt of lightning. She had spent years trying to push the memories away, but now they came rushing back with terrifying clarity. The baby she had never held. The child she had abandoned under her father's orders. Could they be out there, searching for her? A wave of nausea rolled through her. She gripped the edge of the counter, her breath coming in short gasps. She had always feared this day would come, but she had convinced herself it never would. Yet here it was. A secret, once buried, now clawing its way to the surface. The sound of the front door opening made her jump. She whirled around just as Jonathan stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat. His smile was warm, oblivious. "It's pouring out there," he said, setting his lunch pail on the table. "I thought spring was supposed to mean sunshine." She forced herself to smile, her hands still trembling at her sides. "You know how it is," she murmured. Jonathan walked over and kissed her forehead, pausing as he studied her face. "Ellie, you look pale." Her mind scrambled for an explanation. I think I'm just tired," she whispered. "It's been a long day." He frowned but didn't press. "You should rest. I can handle the kids tonight." She nodded, swallowing hard. "That would be nice." She turned away before he could see the panic in her eyes. She had destroyed the letter. But the truth would not burn so easily. Eleanor knew she couldn't keep running from the truth. The letter had shattered any illusion that her past could remain buried. Whoever had sent it knew something, and if another letter arrived, or worse, if Jonathan found out from someone else, her carefully built life would collapse like a house of cards. The weight of it pressed on her chest like an iron chain, suffocating her. For years, she had lived with guilt, hiding the darkest part of herself in the depths of her heart. But as her body weakened, as her reflection in the mirror became gaunter, she realized something terrifying. She was running out of time. The sickness that had been creeping through her veins was growing stronger. Some mornings, she struggled to get out of bed. Some nights, she lay awake, counting the beats of her own heart, wondering how many she had left. She had spent so long pretending that love was enough to hold her marriage together. But what would Jonathan think if he knew the truth? Would he still love her? Would he ever forgive her? One evening, after the children had gone to bed, she sat in the dimly lit kitchen, her fingers tracing the rim of a porcelain teacup. Jonathan sat across from her, studying the way her hands shook. "Ellie, what's wrong?" he asked softly. "You've been so distant lately." She wanted to tell him it was nothing. She wanted to swallow the truth like she always had, to bury it under years of silence. But the words clawed their way up her throat, desperate to be set free. She met his gaze, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jonathan, there's something I need to tell you." His brow furrowed with concern. "Ellie, whatever it is, you can tell me." She hesitated, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. Once she spoke these words, there would be no going back. The walls of their life would crack, maybe even crumble. But if she took this secret to the grave, would she ever find peace? Her breath shuddered. "I didn't marry you because I loved you," she said finally, the confession tearing from her lips like a wound being ripped open. Jonathan stilled. The warmth in his eyes flickered, his fingers tightening around his mug. "What are you saying?" She clenched her hands together, her nails digging into her skin. I married you because I was running away. I needed to escape my father. You were my way out, Jonathan." Silence. A deep, heavy silence that stretched between them like an ocean. He swallowed hard. "Ellie." His voice was hoarse, barely a breath. "There's more," she whispered, unable to stop now. "Before I met you, before I left home, I had a child." Jonathan's face paled. He blinked as if he hadn't heard her correctly. "What?" Tears welled in her eyes. "My father. He forced me to give the baby away. He told me I had no choice. And I believed him. I let them take my child, and I never saw him again." Her voice cracked. "I never even got to hold him." Jonathan pushed back from the table, standing abruptly. His chair scraped against the wooden floor, the sharp sound slicing through the silence. He turned away, pressing a hand to his forehead, his breaths uneven. Eleanor's heart pounded. "Jonathan, please," she begged. "I wanted to tell you for so long, but I was afraid. I thought if you knew, you'd—" He spun back around, his eyes dark with hurt. "You thought I'd what, Eleanor? Leave you? Hate you?" She bit her lip, her vision blurred with tears. "I didn't know what to do. I thought if I buried it deep enough, it would stay in the past." His jaw tightened, but it didn't. She shook her head. "No, it never did." Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, his movements rigid, as if he were trying to hold himself together. He stared at her, searching her face as if he were seeing her for the first time. "For all these years," he said, his voice hollow, "I thought we had built our life on love. I thought I was the man you chose." "You are," she whispered desperately. "I grew to love you. I swear it." He let out a breath, heavy and uneven. "But it started with a lie." Eleanor swallowed back a sob. "Yes," she admitted. "It did." Another long silence stretched between them. Then Jonathan exhaled, shaking his head, his voice almost breaking. "I don't even know what to say." Eleanor reached for him, but he took a step back. She felt the loss of that distance like a dagger to the chest. For the first time since they had fled their pasts, she wasn't sure if their love would survive. Jonathan barely spoke for days after Eleanor's confession. He went to work in silence, ate his meals in silence, and when he lay beside her at night, the space between them felt as wide as an ocean. The warmth that had once filled their home was gone, replaced by a coldness that pressed into Eleanor's chest like a stone. She had known he would be hurt. She had known the truth would shatter something between them, but she hadn't been prepared for this emptiness, this unbearable quiet where love had once lived. She watched him, searching for signs of forgiveness, but his eyes, once filled with tenderness, now held something she couldn't quite name. Not anger, not hatred, but something deeper, something heavier. Pain. He was mourning the life he thought they had. Eleanor's health continued to decline. Each day, her body grew weaker, her hands trembling more, her breaths becoming shallow. The doctor had warned her months ago that there wasn't much time left, but she had kept that truth from Jonathan, just as she had kept so many others. Now, she wondered if she had the strength to fight anymore. One evening, as she lay in bed, exhaustion weighing her down, she felt the mattress shift beside her. A familiar hand, calloused from years of work, gently took hers. She turned her head and found Jonathan watching her. His face was weary, etched with lines of sorrow. "I don't know how to forgive you," he said finally, his voice quiet, almost broken. "I don't know how to make sense of any of this." Eleanor swallowed, her throat dry. "I never meant to hurt you." "I know." He hesitated, his fingers tightening around hers. "But you did." Tears welled in her eyes. "I know." They sat in silence for a long time, the weight of everything between them hanging in the air. Then, unexpectedly, Jonathan sighed. "I keep thinking about that boy." His voice was strained, as if the words pained him. "Your son, the one you lost." Eleanor's chest ached. "I think about him every day." Jonathan nodded slowly, staring at their intertwined fingers. "If I had known, if you had told me from the beginning, I would have searched for him with you." A sob caught in her throat. "I was afraid." "I know," he whispered. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, and for the first time in days, the coldness in his eyes softened. There was still pain, still uncertainty, but beneath it all, there was love. Worn and fractured, but still there. Eleanor felt something inside her break. "I don't deserve you," she whispered. Jonathan shook his head. "Maybe not," he said, a faint, sad smile touching his lips. "But I married you. I built a life with you. And even if it wasn't built the way I thought it was, I can't walk away from it now." Eleanor let out a shaky breath. "Can you ever forgive me?" Jonathan was silent for a long moment. Then, he reached up and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch impossibly gentle. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'll try." Eleanor closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a declaration of absolution, but it was enough. And as she lay there, her body frail, Her heart full of sorrow, she realized that even after everything, even after the lies and the pain, Jonathan was still beside her. And that, more than anything, was love. Eleanor's passing was quiet, as if she had simply drifted away on a breath of wind. Jonathan held her hand until the very end, whispering words of comfort even as his own heart broke. She looked at him one last time, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. Only a soft, tired sigh before her body relaxed into stillness. The funeral was small, attended by a handful of neighbors and the children, Isaac and Margaret, who clung to Jonathan, their young faces filled with grief. He remained strong for them, but inside, he felt hollow. The woman he had spent decades beside was gone, and though their last days had been filled with painful truths, he still loved her. In the days following her burial, Jonathan busied himself with routine. He woke early, went to work, returned home, and repeated the cycle. He thought keeping himself occupied would dull the ache inside him, but it didn't. The house was too quiet. The absence of her presence lingered in every room. Then, one evening, as he went through her belongings, he found the letter. It was tucked inside a wooden drawer, hidden beneath a stack of old sewing patterns. The envelope was creased and slightly yellowed, as if it had been opened and reread many times. His name wasn't on it. It wasn't meant for him. But the moment he saw the first line, his breath caught in his throat. "Your son is looking for you." Jonathan stared at the words, his hands trembling. Her son. The child she had given away. A child that wasn't his. He sank onto the edge of the bed, gripping the letter tightly, his heart pounding. He read it again, forcing himself to take in every word. It wasn't long, just a few lines from someone who had clearly known Eleanor's past. Someone who had discovered the truth and was now reaching out. 1,000 emotions crashed over him. Anger, sadness, confusion, and beneath it all, something he hadn't expected. A deep, aching guilt. He had spent years loving Eleanor, years thinking he knew everything about her. But there had always been a part of her that remained a mystery. And now, in death, she had left him with one final secret. A son out there in the world, lost to time. Jonathan closed his eyes. What was he supposed to do with this? He could burn the letter, pretend he never found it, let the past stay buried, just as Eleanor had wanted. But the thought of that boy, now a grown man, searching for answers, searching for his mother, filled Jonathan with unease. Did he look like her? Did he have her eyes, her way of smiling? Did he even know the truth? Jonathan let out a slow breath, staring at the letter for what felt like hours. He thought about Eleanor, about her final confession, about the pain in her eyes when she spoke of the child she lost. She had carried that grief with her until the very end, and now it was his to bear. He knew what he had to do. The next morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise, Jonathan left the house with the letter tucked safely in his coat pocket. He walked down the quiet street, past the familiar buildings of their town, until he reached the small post office. His hands trembled as he pushed open the door. He didn't know what he would find. He didn't know if meeting this man, this lost son, would bring him peace or more pain. But there was one thing he did know. The past had a way of catching up with you, and it was time to face it. Jonathan stood in the small post office, the letter gripped tightly in his weathered hands. The clerk behind the counter barely glanced at him as he shuffled through stacks of envelopes, waiting for Jonathan to speak. The older man swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had spent the entire night lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering what to do. Now, standing here, he realized there was no turning back. He placed the letter on the counter. "I need to find the sender," he said, his voice rough with hesitation. The clerk squinted at the envelope. "A return address?" Jonathan shook his head. There was nothing, just the simple message scrawled inside, a handful of words that had upended everything he thought he knew. The clerk sighed. "I can't help you if there's no address. Maybe try asking around?" Jonathan clenched his jaw. He had expected this, but the disappointment still settled deep in his bones. He turned away, tucking the letter back into his pocket. If he wanted answers, he would have to search for them himself. Over the next few weeks, Jonathan followed every lead he could. He spoke to old friends of Eleanor's, hoping someone might remember something about the child she had lost. He traveled to towns he had never been to, knocking on doors, asking questions that left people giving him puzzled looks or shaking their heads. It was exhausting, and yet, deep down, he knew he couldn't stop. Not now, not when there was a man out there, a son, who had spent years searching for his mother, only to find that she was already gone. One afternoon, Jonathan sat at his kitchen table, staring at the letter again. He traced the handwriting with his finger, his mind replaying Eleanor's final confession. She had been afraid of what the truth would do, afraid of how it would change everything. And now, Jonathan understood that fear. Because if he found this man, this son of hers, what would he even say? Would the man hate Eleanor for abandoning him? Would he resent her for keeping him a secret? And more than that, what if he wanted nothing to do with Jonathan? The thought was a bitter one, but Jonathan knew he had no choice. He had to try. Days later, he found himself standing on the steps of a modest home in a town a few hours away. He had finally tracked down someone who knew the truth, a woman who had been close to Eleanor's family in the past. She had given him a name, an address. Now, all that was left was to knock. His knuckles rapped against the door, his heart hammering in his chest. The seconds stretched on. Then, the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway. He looked to be in his late 30s, his face carrying the weight of someone who had spent his life searching for something. His eyes, Eleanor's eyes, widened slightly as he took in Jonathan's presence. "Can I help you?" the man asked. Jonathan swallowed. His mouth felt too dry, his hands too unsteady. He had spent so much time preparing for this moment, and yet now that he was here, he had no idea what to say. Finally, he took a deep breath. "My name is Jonathan," he said quietly, "and I think your mother was Eleanor." The man's face shifted. Shock, disbelief, something unreadable passing through his expression. He exhaled, a mixture of pain and relief flickering in his eyes. "I've been looking for her my whole life," he whispered. Jonathan felt something crack open in his chest. "She was looking for you too," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. She didn't know how." The man stepped back slightly, nodding toward the house. "Would you like to come in?" Jonathan hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. As the door closed behind them, he realized something. This wouldn't erase the past. It wouldn't fix the mistakes or mend all the broken pieces. But it was a start. And sometimes the truth, no matter how painful, was the only way forward. Jonathan sat on the worn-out couch in the modest living room, his hands resting on his knees. Across from him sat the man who, until this very moment, had only existed in the shadows of Eleanor's past. The son she had lost. The son she had kept secret. His name was Michael. They spoke for hours, tentative at first, then with the weight of years pouring into every word. Michael had been adopted as a baby, raised in a loving but distant home. He had always known he was different, that something about his origins had been left untold. When he had begun searching for his birth mother, the only thing he had found were locked doors and unanswered questions. Until now, Jonathan told him everything he knew about Eleanor. The way she had loved fiercely but carried an unbearable sorrow. The way she had kept her past locked away in the deepest parts of her heart. He told him about Isaac and Margaret, about the life she had built despite the ghosts that followed her. He even admitted the pain of discovering the truth so late, of realizing that even after 60 years together, there were still things he had never truly known about his wife. Michael listened in silence, his fingers occasionally brushing over an old photograph Jonathan had brought with him. A picture of Eleanor in her younger days, smiling, unaware of the lifetime of regret ahead of her. "She thought about you," Jonathan said finally, his voice heavy. "She never stopped thinking about you." Michael exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "I wish I had found her sooner." "So do I," Jonathan admitted. The room fell into a quiet stillness, the weight of missed years pressing down on both of them. But there was something else, too. A sense of understanding. A fragile bridge forming between them. As Jonathan rose to leave, Michael hesitated before speaking. "Do you think she would have wanted me to know about you?" Jonathan met his gaze. I think she would have wanted you to know you were never forgotten. Michael nodded slowly, and for the first time since Jonathan had arrived, a small, almost imperceptible smile flickered across his face. Jonathan stepped out into the crisp evening air, the sky painted in soft hues of orange and purple. As he walked away, he felt lighter, not because the past had been erased, but because, for the first time, the truth had finally been spoken. Eleanor had lived with secrets. She had carried the weight of choices that could never be undone. But in the end, love had still been there, imperfect, messy, and flawed, but real nonetheless. Jonathan took a deep breath, looking up at the sky. Perhaps the past could never be changed, but the future? That was still unwritten. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this story until the end. I hope it brought you deep emotions and enjoyable moments. If you like the story, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe so you won't miss any exciting videos in the future. Feel free to share this story with your friends and family and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks again for your support, and I look forward to seeing you in the next story.